The phone was in his golf bag. Not hidden exactly, tucked into the side pocket where he kept the extra tees and the ball marker his father gave him. I only found it because I was looking for the receipt for the garage door opener, the one he swore he'd submitted to the insurance company after the spring broke. That was the thing about Marcus. He was meticulous about some things and completely absent about others. The insurance paperwork was always my job, apparently, even when he said he'd handle it. Even when I was working 60 hours a week and he was between consulting contracts for the third time in 4 years. Let me back up. We'd been married 11 years. 11 years, 2 miscarriages, 1 foreclosure scare, and a relocation to a city where I knew exactly nobody because his career needed a fresh start. That's how he framed it. His career needed the fresh start. Not us, not the marriage, his career. And I went along with it, because that's what you do when you've built a life with someone. You tell yourself the sacrifices are shared, even when the math doesn't add up. I want you to hold on to that word, sacrifices, because by the time I found the phone, I'd made so many of them I'd stopped counting. The first 2 years in Phoenix were hard. I won't pretend they weren't. I left a job I loved, director of communications at a nonprofit in Portland that actually did meaningful work, to move to a city where I knew nobody. Marcus had taken a position at a tech startup that promised equity and delivered exactly nothing. Within 8 months, they'd folded, and I was the one with the steady paycheck again. I didn't resent it, not at first. I told myself we were a team. I told myself he'd do the same for me. But somewhere around the 3rd year, things started to shift. It was small at first. The way he'd leave the room to take phone calls. The new cologne he bought and never mentioned. The Saturday golf games that stretched from 4 hours to 7. When I asked about it, and I did ask, gently, the way you do when you're afraid of sounding like the jealous wife you promised yourself you'd never become, he looked at me with genuine hurt in his eyes and said, "Lena, I'm just trying to network. Do you want me to just give up?" And I backed off, because the hurt looked real, because I didn't want to be that woman. I became that woman anyway. Not the jealous wife, the one who doubts her own instincts, the one who hears the little voice in her head saying something is wrong and tells it to be quiet because the alternative is too exhausting to face. The gaslighting didn't come all at once. It never does. It came in drips. The time I found a receipt for 2 dinners at a restaurant I'd never been to, and he said it was a client meeting, and when I asked which client, he sighed and said, "You know, Lena, not everything requires an audit." The time his phone buzzed at 11:30 on a Tuesday, and he flipped it over so fast his elbow knocked his water glass off the nightstand. "Work thing," he said, before I even asked. "They're on Tokyo time now." The time I suggested we take a weekend trip. Just the 2 of us, like we used to. And he said he couldn't because his mother needed help with the yard. His mother lived 600 miles away. When I pointed that out, he said I'd misunderstood. He'd meant he was going to help her hire someone. Over the phone. And then he looked at me with that same wounded expression and asked why I was always looking for problems. Here's what I need you to understand. I am not a naive woman. I am not someone who ignores red flags. I'm someone who spent years in communications. I know how language works. I know how people spin things. But when you're inside it, when the person spinning is the person you sleep next to, the person who held you in the hospital after the 2nd miscarriage and cried into your hair, the flags don't look red. They look like misunderstandings. They look like your own insecurity. They look like the reasonable explanation you'd want someone to extend to you. So I doubted myself. For 2 years, I doubted myself. I started keeping a journal. Not because I thought he was lying, but because I thought I was forgetting things. Conversations we'd had, plans we'd made. I'd write down what he said, and then, 3 days later, I'd check it against what he claimed he'd said. The discrepancies were small but consistent. A dinner he swore he'd told me about. A weekend trip to see a college friend he'd mentioned weeks ago that I somehow had no memory of. I started to believe I was losing my grip. The stress of the move, the job, the miscarriages, maybe it had all caught up with me. Maybe I really was paranoid. I even made an appointment with a neurologist. I sat in that office and described my symptoms: memory lapses, confusion, the sense that I couldn't trust my own recall. And I watched the doctor nod sympathetically and order a battery of tests. I was so deep in it that I thought the problem was my brain. And all the while, Marcus was so kind. That's the part that still gets me. He was so kind about my memory issues. He'd remind me of things gently. He'd text me confirmations of plans just so we're on the same page. He told me he was worried about me, that maybe the move had been harder on me than I realized, that he'd support me no matter what. He looked like the devoted husband. Everyone in our lives thought he was a saint for putting up with my confusion. I want you to sit with that for a second. He made me believe I was broken, and then he comforted me for being broken, and I was grateful to him for it. That Tuesday morning, the day I found the phone, I wasn't looking for evidence. I'd stopped looking for evidence months ago. I'd accepted the narrative that I was an anxious, forgetful woman with a patient husband who loved her anyway. I was just looking for the garage door receipt because the insurance adjuster needed it by Friday, and Marcus had said he'd put it in the folder with the other household documents. But it wasn't in the folder. It wasn't in his desk. It wasn't in the kitchen drawer where he sometimes stashed things when he was in a hurry. So I went to the garage, and I unzipped the side pocket of his golf bag, the one he never used anymore, because he'd joined a club with a locker room and kept his good clubs there. The bag was dusty. It hadn't been touched in months. The phone was wrapped in an old towel, charged to 63%. No passcode. I turned it on, and the lock screen was a photo of a woman I'd never seen before, holding a toddler with Marcus's exact shade of green eyes. I didn't scream. I didn't throw the phone. I didn't do any of the things I would have imagined myself doing in that moment, back when I still thought of myself as someone who would know how to handle betrayal. I just stood there, in the garage, with the Arizona heat pressing against the door like a living thing. And I looked at the toddler's face, the green eyes, the little chin, his chin, the way the woman had her arm wrapped around the child's waist with the easy possession of a mother who has never had to share. I think I held my breath for 30 seconds, maybe longer. Long enough that the edges of my vision started to go soft. Then I did something I still can't fully explain. I walked back into the house, sat down at the kitchen table, and set the phone face down in front of me like it was a live grenade. Which, in a way, it was. Not the phone itself. The phone was just plastic and glass and a lithium battery. The grenade was everything inside it, and I hadn't even opened it yet. Here's what I knew in that moment. Marcus had a second phone. Marcus had a lock screen photo of a woman and a child I'd never seen. Marcus had hidden that phone in a golf bag he thought I'd never touch. Here's what I didn't know yet. The phone wasn't the worst thing. The phone was just the door. Behind that door was a room so much bigger than I was ready for. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Because the first thing I did, the very first thing, was nothing. I sat there for an hour, maybe more. I listened to the clock on the microwave tick. I watched the light change on the patio. I thought about the neurologist, the memory tests, the way Marcus had looked at me with such tender concern when I forgot something he'd supposedly told me. I thought about all of it. And for the first time in 2 years, I let myself think the thought I had been too afraid to even form. What if I was never the problem? Around here, we don't just survive it, we understand it. So if you're sitting there and you've just found something you weren't supposed to find, and your hands are shaking and your stomach is doing that thing where it won't settle, I need you to know that what I did next isn't the only right way to handle it. But it worked. And if you've been made to feel crazy, if someone has spent months or years convincing you that your instincts are broken, maybe what I did will help you too. I didn't confront him. Not that day. Not that week. Instead, I did something Marcus had trained me, unintentionally or not, to be very good at. I paid attention. I documented. I waited. That first night, after he came home and kissed my forehead and asked how my day was, I smiled and said fine. And then I watched him. Really watched him. The way his eyes flicked to his phone, his regular phone, every few minutes. The way he angled his screen away from me when he typed. The way he told me around 9 o'clock that he was going to take a shower, and I heard the water run for exactly 45 seconds before it stopped, and the quiet murmur of his voice started through the bathroom door. I'd seen all of it before, dozens of times, hundreds. I just hadn't let myself see it. That night, after he fell asleep, I went back to the garage. I took the phone out of the golf bag and I sat in my car in the driveway and I opened it. The Messages app was pinned. The thread was under a contact name I didn't recognize. Dan from Phoenix office. But Dan from Phoenix office had sent approximately 300 texts in the last month, and none of them were about work. Her name was Tamara. I learned that in the first 6 messages. Tamara. She lived in Scottsdale. She had a son named Julian. Julian was 18 months old. Julian was born 14 months after we moved to Phoenix. I did the math in my head while the car windows fogged up from my breathing. The messages went back further than I expected. Not months, years. Nearly 3 years of messages. 3 years of her asking when he was coming over. 3 years of him telling her he loved her. 3 years of photos, birthday parties, first steps, a hospital bracelet with the name Julian Marcus printed on it. He'd given the child his name. Not just his last name, his first. Julian Marcus. I had lost 2 pregnancies with this man, and he had named another woman's child after himself. I want you to understand something about that moment. It wasn't the rage that was the problem. The rage was there, but it was far away, like thunder from a storm that hadn't reached me yet. The problem was the clarity. The sudden, absolutely devastating clarity. Because in the space of about 45 minutes, sitting in my own car in my own driveway at 1 in the morning, I realized that everything I doubted about myself for 2 years had been manufactured. The memory lapses? Manufactured. The The confusion? Manufactured. The feeling that I was losing my grip? Deliberately, carefully, lovingly manufactured by a man who needed me to believe I was unreliable so that I would never trust myself enough to catch him. It was almost elegant in a monstrous kind of way. Here's how it worked. He'd tell me about a plan, a dinner, a weekend trip, and then he'd deny he'd ever said it. He'd move small items in the house and insist they'd always been there. He'd change the password on shared accounts and claim I'd forgotten it. Each individual incident was so minor that I couldn't point to it and say, see what he's doing? But the cumulative effect, the slow erosion of my confidence in my own perceptions, was as precise as surgery. And all the while, he was building a second family. In Scottsdale, 40 minutes from our house. I didn't sleep that night. I put the phone back in the golf bag, exactly where I'd found it, wrapped in the towel, angled the same way. And I lay in bed next to him until the alarm went off. He kissed me goodbye at 7:15. He said, "Love you, babe." He said it the same way he'd always said it. The door closed, his car pulled out of the driveway, and I started making calls. Not the kind of calls you're probably thinking. I didn't call a lawyer, not yet. I didn't call my mother or my best friend. I called the neurologist's office and canceled the follow-up. I called a forensic accountant. And I called a woman I'd met at a conference 3 years earlier who happened to be one of the best divorce attorneys in the state of Arizona. But I'm getting ahead of myself again. Because first I had to find out who Tamara was and what she knew, and whether Julian Marcus was the only child my husband had fathered, while I was scheduling memory tests to prove I wasn't losing my mind. And that ordinary Wednesday morning, with the coffee still warm and the garage door receipt still unfound, is where the story actually begins. The forensic accountant's name was Gretchen. She worked out of a small office in Tempe that smelled like toner and old carpet, and she had the kind of face that had seen every possible way a spouse could hide money. When I sat down across from her desk and explained the situation, the second phone, the second family, the 3 years of gaslighting, she didn't flinch. She just opened a file folder, clicked her pen, and said, "The first thing you need to know is that people who lead double lives almost always have double finances. The lies cost money. The money leaves a trail." She asked for our account numbers, our tax returns, any property records. I gave her access to everything I could think of. The joint checking, the savings, the investment account Marcus's uncle had helped him set up years ago, the retirement funds. I didn't know yet that the accounts I was giving her were only the ones I knew about. That same afternoon, my divorce attorney, a woman named Naomi with silver hair and a voice like a blade wrapped in silk, told me to do nothing. "Do not confront him," she said. "Do not tip your hand. You found the phone. That's your advantage. You use it to gather everything you need before he knows you're looking. The moment he knows you know, he will start covering his tracks. And trust me, Lena, men who do this kind of thing are very good at covering their tracks." So I waited. For 8 days, I waited. I smiled when he came home. I made dinner. I asked about his day. And every night, after he fell asleep, I went into the garage and read more of the messages on the second phone. I learned that Tamara believed Marcus was divorced, that she thought I was his ex-wife who lived in Portland and had refused to sign the papers out of spite. That was the story he'd fed her. I was the bitter ex, dragging things out, and he was the devoted father driving 40 minutes each way to be with his real family. The cruelty of that, the specific, detailed cruelty of erasing me from my own marriage while still sleeping in my bed, was almost impossible to hold in my head. But there was something else in those messages, something I read 3 times before I understood what I was looking at. Tamara had asked him, about 2 months before I found the phone, whether the house situation was resolved. Marcus had replied, "Almost. The paperwork is in motion. She won't know until it's done. And by then, it'll be too late for her to do anything about it." I read that message at 2 in the morning, sitting cross-legged on the garage floor with the concrete cold beneath me, and I felt the floor tilt. What paperwork? What house situation? Too late for what? I forwarded screenshots of the message to myself from the second phone, deleted the forward from his sent folder, and sent the screenshots to Naomi. Her email back came at 6:15 the next morning. It said, "Lena, call me as soon as you wake up. Do not talk to Marcus about anything financial until we've spoken." I called her from my car in the grocery store parking lot. "Your husband," Naomi said, without preamble, "filed a petition 3 months ago to have you declared mentally incapacitated." I didn't understand the words at first. They didn't fit into any shape I could recognize. What? He submitted medical records, your medical records, to a court. He claimed you were suffering from early onset dementia or some other cognitive decline. He requested power of attorney over your financial and medical decisions. He also requested that the court grant him sole ownership of the house under a spousal protection provision in Arizona law. The neurologist, the memory tests, the appointments I'd told him about, the ones he'd been so supportive of. He'd taken my genuine fear and turned it into a legal weapon. "The petition is still pending," Naomi continued. "It hasn't been ruled on yet. But here's the part you need to hear, Lena. He didn't just file for power of attorney. He filed for a quitclaim deed transfer. He was trying to get your name removed from the title of the house entirely. And he was using your own medical records, your own doctor's notes about your subjective complaints of memory loss as evidence." Let me say that again because I had to hear it 3 times before it sank in. The man had been gaslighting me for 2 years to make me believe I was losing my mind. He'd been so successful that I voluntarily sought medical help. I had created a paper trail of my own, quote, decline. And then he had taken that paper trail, my confusion, my fear, my desperate attempt to find out what was wrong with me, and he had handed it to a judge as proof that I couldn't manage my own life. And then he planned to take the house. The house my grandmother's inheritance had helped us buy. The house I'd spent 4 years making payments on while he was between consulting contracts. The house he intended to put in his own name, alone, before I even knew there was a problem. He was going to take the house and the money and the future. And he was going to do it by convincing the legal system that I was too broken to stop him. And the irony, the absolutely stunning, perfectly crafted irony, was that if I hadn't found the phone, he might have pulled it off. I was already doubting myself. I was already convinced something was wrong with my brain. If a court order had arrived declaring me mentally incapacitated, I might have believed it. I might have signed whatever they put in front of me, because I had already been trained to believe that Marcus was the reliable one, and I was the one who couldn't trust her own mind. That was his plan. That was the house situation Tamara had asked about. And the she who wouldn't know until it was done, that was me. But I'm getting ahead of myself, because I want you to hold on to this moment, this exact moment in the story, where the plan is in motion, and I know about it, but Marcus doesn't know I know. I want you to sit in the dread of it. The house you've paid for, the life you've built, the name on the title, and someone is in a courtroom right now, using your own words against you, trying to take it all. And he still thinks you believe him. I want to tell you that I drove straight to Naomi's office and we filed an emergency motion and the whole thing was resolved by lunch. But that's not what happened. That's not how the legal system works. And it's not how revenge works. Not the quiet kind, anyway. What I did instead was sit in that grocery store parking lot for 45 minutes with the engine off and the Arizona sun turning my car into an oven. And I let myself feel all of it. The rage, the humiliation, the specific, nauseating horror of realizing that the man who had held me in the hospital after we lost the second baby, who had cried with me, or seemed to, had been methodically dismantling my life while I slept beside him. And then I did something that surprised even me. I stopped feeling sorry for myself, and I got angry. Not the kind of angry that throws dishes, the kind of angry that makes a spreadsheet. I called Naomi back, and I said, "Tell me exactly what I need to do to make sure he loses." Here's what Naomi told me. The petition Marcus had filed was still pending, which meant no ruling had been issued. That was the first piece of good news. The second was that Arizona is a community property state, and any attempt to transfer the house without my knowledge or consent was, at minimum, grounds for a counterpetition. The third piece of good news was that Marcus, in his arrogance, had made a mistake. A big one. In his petition, he'd sworn under oath that I was unable to manage my own affairs due to progressive cognitive decline. He'd submitted my medical records. He'd submitted a letter from a doctor. Not the neurologist I'd seen, but a different one. Someone I'd never met, whose signature I didn't recognize. When Naomi pulled that signature and cross-referenced it with the Arizona Medical Board database, the name wasn't there. The doctor didn't exist. Marcus, or someone he'd paid, had forged a medical opinion. And forgery, Naomi said, in a voice so calm it was almost cheerful, is a felony. I remember sitting in her office when she told me that. I remember the way the light came through the blinds and made stripes across her desk. And I remember thinking, he's not just going to lose, he's going to bury himself. And he handed me the shovel. But we weren't done yet, because there was still Gretchen, the forensic accountant, and what she found over the next 5 days changed everything. Marcus had accounts I'd never seen. Not one, not two, 5 separate accounts spread across 3 banks, totaling just under $240,000. The money had been siphoned from our joint savings in small increments over 3 years. Sometimes $1,000 a month, sometimes $3,000, always described in the transfer logs as consulting business expenses, or equipment purchase, or tax reserve. The paper trail was careful, but not brilliant. He'd assumed I wouldn't look, and for 2 years I hadn't. But there was more. One of those accounts was paying the mortgage on a condominium in Scottsdale, a condominium that had been purchased 18 months earlier, in Tamra's name, with my husband's money, our money. The down payment, $47,000, had come directly from our home equity line, which Marcus had increased 2 years earlier by forging my signature on the application. Let me pause here and tell you what that felt like. Not the betrayal. I'd already processed the betrayal. What I felt, sitting in Gretchen's office with the bank statements spread across the desk, was something closer to clarity. He hadn't just lied to me. He hadn't just cheated. He had systematically dismantled our financial future to build a new one with someone else. And he had done it while I was making his dinner and scheduling his dentist appointments and believing, genuinely believing, that I was the one who was failing. The thing about quiet revenge is that it requires you to stay quiet. That was the hardest part. Harder than the financial discoveries, harder than the forged signatures. For 10 days, I had to walk around my house and look at Marcus and not scream. I had to listen to him talk about his day. I had to accept his casual touches, the hand on my shoulder, the kiss on the top of my head, while knowing that in 60 days, if his plan worked, I would be legally incapacitated and homeless. One night, about a week into this, he came home with Thai food, my favorite order, pad see ew with extra broccoli. He set the containers on the counter and said, "I was thinking we should take a trip, just the two of us. Maybe Sedona. You've seemed stressed lately." I looked at him. I looked at this man who had a second phone in his golf bag and a second family in Scottsdale and a forged medical opinion in a court file with my name on it. And I said, "Sedona sounds nice." And the thing was, he believed me. He believed me completely. Because he had spent 2 years convincing himself that I was weak and confused and incapable of seeing what was right in front of me. That was his real mistake. Not the forgery, not the secret accounts. His real mistake was underestimating the woman he'd married. Naomi filed our counter motion on a Thursday. She filed it under seal, which meant Marcus wouldn't be notified until the judge reviewed both petitions side by side. The counter motion included Gretchen's forensic accounting report. It included the forged doctor's signature. It included screenshots from the second phone, the ones where Marcus told Tamra I was his bitter ex-wife, the ones where he said the paperwork was in motion, the ones where he said I wouldn't know until it was too late. And it included something else. Something I hadn't known Naomi was going to include until she handed me the final draft. She had requested that the court not only dismiss Marcus's petition, but transfer the house entirely into my name. Sole ownership. She'd also requested that the hidden accounts, all $240,000 of them, be frozen pending a full asset division hearing. And she'd referred Marcus to the State Bar Association for fraud and to the county prosecutor's office for the forged medical signature. When I asked her if all of that was possible, she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Lena, your husband tried to have you declared incompetent so he could steal your house. The judge is not going to be on his side." But none of it had happened yet. The motion was filed, but Marcus didn't know. The accounts were flagged, but the freeze order hadn't been signed. The court date was set for 3 weeks away, and I still had to live in that house, with him, for every single one of those days. And then Tamra called me. Not him, not his phone. She called my phone. On a Friday afternoon, while I was standing in the produce section, buying limes for a dinner I had no intention of eating. She said her name was Tamra, and she needed to know if I was really Marcus's ex-wife, or if she'd been lied to for 3 years. And that conversation, that unexpected, terrifying, impossibly brave conversation, changed the shape of everything that came next. I pulled my cart to the side of the produce section, next to the avocados, and I said the only thing I could think of to say. "This is Lena, and no, I'm not his ex-wife. I'm his wife. Right now. Today. We've been married 11 years. The silence on the other end of the line lasted so long I thought she'd hung up. Then I heard her exhale, a long, shaky breath that sounded like it had been held for years. "He told me you lived in Portland," she said. "He told me you'd been separated since 2019 and you just wouldn't sign the papers. He said you were unstable, that you'd refused treatment, and that's why he had to leave." I closed my eyes, right there in the produce section. An elderly woman with a walker maneuvered around me, and I didn't move. "Tamra," I said, and my voice was steadier than I felt. I have never lived in Portland since we moved here. We have never been separated. I only found out about you 8 days ago because I found his second phone in a golf bag. And the unstable thing, he's been making me believe I was losing my mind for 2 years so I wouldn't catch him. He took me to doctors. He had me tested. And then he used those test results to file a court petition to have me declared mentally incompetent so he could take our house. This time the silence was shorter, and when Tamara spoke again, her voice had changed. It wasn't confused anymore. It was furious. That son of a... She stopped herself. I heard a child's voice in the background, Julian. She must have moved to another room because the background noise faded. I met him 3.5 years ago, at a work conference. He told me he was divorced. He showed me a rental house in Tempe and said it was his. He said he wanted to have a baby with me. I believed all of it, every word. I built my whole life around him because I thought... Her voice cracked, and in that moment, something shifted between us. We were not enemies. We had never been enemies. We were two women who had been fed different versions of the same lie by the same man, while we both poured our time and our trust and our futures into a person who had never existed. Tamara, I need to ask you something, and you don't have to answer, but I need to know. Ask. Did you know about any of this? About me? The answer came fast, too fast to be rehearsed. No, I swear on my son's life, I didn't know. I thought you were in Portland. I thought you were refusing the divorce. He showed me legal documents. He showed me emails from his attorney about the delays. It all looked real. It all felt real. She'd been gaslit too, differently than I had, but the mechanics were the same. He'd given her just enough paperwork to make the story hold, and he'd made her the villain in a narrative where she was actually another victim. Marcus had been running 2 parallel manipulation campaigns simultaneously, convincing me I was crazy and convincing her I was cruel. And he'd done it for years without either of us catching on. I want to pause here and say something directly to you, because I know some of you are thinking what I would have thought a year ago. How could she not have known? How could she not have checked? But the truth is, most of us don't fact-check the people we love. We don't run background checks on the man who holds us after a nightmare. We believe the story because believing is easier than investigating. And if someone is good enough at lying, and Marcus was very, very good, you can live inside their fabrication for years without ever touching the edges. Tamara and I talked for 47 minutes. I know the exact time because I looked at my call log later. By the end of it, she was no longer crying. She was taking notes. Here's what Tamara told me, and why it mattered so much to the legal case Naomi was building. Marcus had bought the condo in Scottsdale, but he had put it in Tamara's name, alone, not joint ownership, hers. He had done this, she explained, because he said his divorce complications made it easier to keep assets in her name temporarily. She had the deed. She had the mortgage documents. She had the bank statements showing the down payment. And she had... And this is the detail that made Naomi actually smile when I told her. A voicemail from Marcus, saved from 18 months ago, in which he said, and I quote, "Don't worry about the money, babe. It's coming from the home equity line. Lena doesn't even know the line exists anymore. She can't track it." He'd confessed. On tape. To wire fraud, to mortgage fraud, to hiding assets. And he'd done it to reassure his mistress that the wife, the unstable, difficult, Portland-dwelling ex-wife of his imagination, would never find out. Tamara sent me the voicemail that night. She also sent me screenshots of their text conversations going back to the beginning. She sent me photos of Marcus with Julian, at the zoo, at a birthday party, at the hospital the day the baby was born. She sent me a copy of the condo deed with her name on it and the mortgage statement showing the Scottsdale address. She sent me everything, and she did it knowing that it would take down the father of her child. She did it because, in her words, if he did this to you, he'll do it to me eventually, and I'd rather be the one holding the evidence when that day comes. I forwarded everything to Naomi within the hour. The next 2 weeks were the strangest of my life. Marcus was still in the house. He was still playing the devoted husband. He brought me coffee in bed on Saturday morning. He suggested we watch a movie together on Sunday night, some thriller about a man with a secret identity, which I watched with a stillness that I think, in retrospect, should have scared him. He had no idea that Tamara had called me. He had no idea that Tamara had turned. He had no idea that Naomi's counter motion was sitting on a judge's desk with a hearing date circled in red. But I knew. And knowing, truly knowing, with evidence in my hands and a lawyer at my back, felt like waking up from a coma. The fog I'd been living in for 2 years lifted so completely that I couldn't believe I'd ever doubted myself. The confusion, the memory lapses, the constant low-grade anxiety that I was failing somehow, all of it disappeared. Because it had never been mine. It had been something he'd done to me. And now I had the proof, and the fog was just gone. 1 week before the hearing, Gretchen called with one more piece of information. She'd been digging into the accounts Marcus had opened, and she'd found something unusual. One of the hidden accounts, the one with the largest balance, had been opened not in Phoenix or Scottsdale, but in Nevada. And the name on the account wasn't Marcus's. It wasn't Tamara's either. It was his mother's. Barbara. His 68-year-old mother in Reno, who sent me birthday cards every year and called me the daughter she'd never had. She'd been holding money for him. Our money. The money he'd siphoned from our joint accounts and our home equity line. She'd been the custodian on an account that now held over $90,000. And Barbara, Gretchen informed me, was listed as a co-conspirator in the fraud filing Naomi was preparing for the court. I thought about the last birthday card Barbara had sent me. It had a picture of a sunflower on the front, and inside she'd written, "So grateful for you, Lena. You've been such a gift to our family." The gift, apparently, was $90,000 and my silence. The night before the hearing, Marcus made pasta, penne with vodka sauce, the recipe he'd learned in the first year of our marriage and had made exactly often enough to seem special. He lit a candle, he poured wine. He asked me how I was feeling about things, and when I said I was feeling clearer than I had in a long time, he smiled and said he was glad. He said he'd been worried about me. He said he loved me. I looked at him across the table. This man I'd loved enough to move across the country for, enough to grieve with, enough to doubt myself for. And I felt nothing. Not love, not hate, just the quiet, settled certainty of someone who has finally seen the truth and cannot unsee it. "I love you too," I said, and I meant it as a goodbye. The hearing was scheduled for 9 o'clock on a Thursday morning. Marcus left the house at his usual time, 7:15, with no idea that I wouldn't be going to work that day. No idea that Naomi was already at the courthouse. No idea that Gretchen's forensic report had been entered into evidence the previous afternoon. No idea that Tamara was sitting in a parked car 3 blocks from the courthouse, waiting to be called as a witness if the judge wanted to hear from her directly. I watched him drive away from the kitchen window. Then I went upstairs, put on the navy blue dress I'd bought specifically for this occasion, and drove myself to the courthouse. Here's what happened in that courtroom. And I'm going to tell it to you exactly as it happened, because some moments don't need embellishment. Marcus was already seated at the petitioner's table when I walked in. He had his attorney beside him, a man in an expensive suit who looked deeply uncomfortable, and I later learned why. Naomi had sent over our counter motion and all supporting evidence the night before. Marcus's attorney had spent the hours between midnight and 8 in the morning reading about his client's forged medical signatures, hidden bank accounts, and wire fraud. By the time I took my seat at the respondents' table, the attorney was avoiding eye contact with his own client. Marcus looked at me, and for 1 second, one brief, crystalline second, he didn't understand. He saw me in my navy dress with my attorney beside me, and his face flickered with confusion. Then he saw Naomi open her binder. He saw the thickness of it, the tabs, the exhibits, the bank records flagged with fluorescent post-it notes. And I watched the color drain from his face. "What are you doing here?" he said. It wasn't a question, it was a realization. I didn't answer him. I didn't have to. The bailiff called the court to order, and the judge, a woman named Judge Reyes with silver reading glasses and the kind of face that had seen every possible permutation of marital betrayal, entered the room. I won't walk you through every procedural detail. Court proceedings are, for the most part, remarkably boring. What matters is this. Naomi presented the counter motion. She submitted the forensic accounting report. She submitted the forged doctor's letter with the non-existent medical license number. She submitted the voicemail, the one where Marcus told Tamara that I couldn't track the home equity line. She submitted the Nevada account records with Barbara's name on them. She submitted the condo deed in Tamara's name, purchased with our marital assets. She submitted the screenshots of the messages where Marcus told another woman I was his bitter ex-wife. And then she submitted the petition Marcus himself had filed, the one where he'd sworn under oath that I was mentally incapacitated, while simultaneously hiding a second family, draining our accounts, and conspiring with his mother to hide $90,000 in a Nevada bank. Judge Reyes read through the evidence for 22 minutes. The only sound in the courtroom was the turning of pages and the quiet, ragged sound of Marcus breathing. When she looked up, she removed her glasses. She looked at Marcus's attorney, and she said, "Counselor, I'm going to give you one opportunity to explain to me why your client should not be referred to the county prosecutor for fraud, forgery, and attempted financial elder abuse." Elder abuse. I was 39 years old. But the legal standard for elder abuse in Arizona applies to vulnerable adults, and Marcus's petition, the one claiming I was mentally incompetent, had triggered that classification. The very thing he'd filed to steal my house had placed me in a protected legal category he'd never considered. You cannot write irony that perfect. You just can't. Marcus's attorney asked for a recess. It was denied. He asked for a continuance. It was denied. He asked if his client could speak. Judge Reyes told him that his client had already spoken, in text messages, in voicemails, in forged medical documents, and in a sworn petition that now constituted perjury, and that anything further would be ill-advised. The ruling came down at 11:43 in the morning. Marcus's petition was dismissed with prejudice, meaning he could never refile. The house was transferred into my sole ownership, effective immediately. The hidden accounts, all $240,000, were frozen and ordered to be divided in a full asset hearing, with Naomi requesting that the funds Marcus had diverted to Tamara's condo be returned to the marital estate. The Nevada account in Barbara's name was flagged for a separate fraud investigation, and Marcus himself was referred to the county prosecutor for the forged medical signature and the fraudulent petition. But the judge wasn't done. She looked at Marcus, directly at him, and she said something I will never forget. She said, "Mr. Cole, in 23 years on this bench, I have seen many things, But I have rarely seen a scheme this calculated, this cruel, and this meticulously documented by its own perpetrator. You did the work for the court yourself. You gave us the evidence. You signed the forms. You left the trail. The only thing your wife's attorney had to do was collect what you'd already handed out. She closed the file. She tapped it once with her glasses, and she said, "We're adjourned." Marcus didn't look at me when he left. His attorney was already halfway out the door. The bailiff had to remind Marcus that he was free to go. He stood up like a man in water, slow, heavy, resisting the current. And then he was gone. I stayed in my chair for a long time after the courtroom emptied. Naomi put her hand on my shoulder and said she'd meet me outside. The bailiff nodded at me with something that looked like respect. And I sat there, in the quiet, in the navy blue dress I'd bought for the occasion, and I let myself feel it. Not the victory, that would come later. Not the relief, that would take weeks. What I felt in that moment was something simpler. I felt sane. I felt completely, unshakably, irrevocably sane. The fog was gone. The doubt was gone. The version of myself that Marcus had built, the confused, anxious, forgetful woman who couldn't trust her own mind, had never existed. She was a character he'd written, and I was done playing her. The firelight is always on. I'll see you next time. You know, after I told this story to a friend of mine, she asked me what the worst part was, and I had to think about it. It wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the money. It was the 2 years I spent believing I was broken. Because that's 2 years I don't get back. 2 years of doubting the one person who was actually telling me the truth, myself. So if you take anything from today's story, take this. Someone else's lies do not define you. And the moment you stop believing them is the moment you start being free. Around here, we don't just survive it. We understand it. And then we let it go.